Ki Fateh Ji. We welcome all the viewers of Sikh Channel to this conversation with Professor Eleanor Nesbitt, who is the Emeritus Professor of Education Studies at University of Warwick. But today we are going to speak to her as an author of her new book, Sikh to Centuries of Western Women's Art and Writing. Very interesting topic to read at first. Even more interesting is the perspective it's written from. So let's hear it from Professor Nesbitt herself. We welcome her on Sikh Channel, although this is another media platform that Professor Nesbitt has appeared on. She has also been interviewed on BBC before, and rightly so, because research on this topic is very new and looking into Sikh faith and its people, but from the perspective of the Western women. So we welcome Professor Nesbitt on Sikh Channel here for you to have a conversation and ask her more about the book. Professor Nesbitt, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. We welcome you here.
Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
That was almost perfect for somebody, saying Fateh, the greeting, the Sikh greeting for the first time. And I can see your knowledge from the extensive research into Sikh faith has made you quite proficient in even the pronunciation of the words, the way you just said the greeting as well.
Thank you.
So, as I just mentioned, 2 centuries of Western women's art and writing. This is a groundbreaking exploration of around 170 women and their interaction, their engagement with Sikh faith, its culture, its people over past 200 years. You have been into research and been studying Sikh faith for a lot of time now, but what interested you into this particular intersection of Western women and their perspective about Sikh faith? How did you come about to be looking very specifically into this intersection of demography?
Well, it's a good question. And as you say, I had been writing about Sikhs for a long time. And my first contact with Sikhs was in the mid 1970s in India. But what I found when I was doing various pieces of research was that there were compilations of Westerners' writings about Sikhs. But when I looked, all the names were men's names, except in fact for one woman, Dorothy Field, and she appeared in two anthologies of Western writing about Sikhs. One was a compilation by Dr. Ganga Singh and one by Professor J.S. Grariwal. But
Right.
I wanted to know, well, who was this woman? And did any other women write about Sikhs? Was it only men? I mean, of course, I knew there were people like me in the last part of the 20th century and nowadays who are academics who are not Sikh themselves and who conduct studies of Sikhs. But I wasn't so much focusing on them. I was looking at women from the beginning of the 19th century onwards who were
Right.
travelers and novelists and so on. And I discovered that there was an absolutely massive amount of material, watercolors, photographs later on, um, novels which had been well researched with Sikh characters, travelogues, as you'd expect, diaries, letters, even two poems.
Right. So that is interesting. And which one of that was your favorite piece of art, whether it be in a photograph, painting, or any form of writing? Which one
Oh, that's so
become
difficult
your favorite?
because my book's got 442 pictures in it. I mean, some of them are pictures of the women, but most of them are pictures of Sikh places and Sikh people. And I have favourites for
Yeah.
different reasons. I mean, I suppose one has to be the first known photograph of Harmandir
Mm.
Sahib, of Darbar Sahib,
Yes.
which was taken in
Mm.
1857 or 1858. And the process then, the silver nitrate albumin method, um, took a long time. And in fact, the printing didn't happen until 1859. But it's one of my favourite images, partly because it's so historically important and it's visually very clear. It's a
Yeah.
black and white picture, obviously, but also because of the story around it. Because if you think about 1857, it was the time of the
Mm.
Sepoy Uprising. And in fact, Harriet Titler, who's the woman concerned with taking this photograph, was the one English woman who had been a captive in Dili during the siege because she was heavily pregnant. Um, and she manages to get away from Dili in a donkey cart. She gives birth to her child, who is then called Stanley Delhi Force Titler. She manages to give birth in this donkey cart, and she fetches up in Amritsar, with all the equipment that would be needed. And she and her husband, Robert, they take this historic photograph.
Mm. Right.
You can see from
And
that picture just how how weighty the book is. I'm told it's 4.5 kilos.
that's right. But I was looking that you have covered 2 centuries, and you've covered the stories from 170 women. How did you choose whose voices and whose perspective you're going to put in? And if, I mean, I'm aware that even these 170 women are from various walks of life, from various different professions, from there's an age difference, the various kinds of works and jobs that they were, and backgrounds that they were coming from. And how did you choose, these are the women, and this is a piece of art that is going to matter the most and is going to have a place in your book?
Well, the women chose me really because I was at work collecting material, apart from what I already happened to have, from the time when I was commissioned in 2017 up until, the year of publication, 2024. So I was open to receiving material, and so too was the publisher, Paramjit Singh of Kashi House. Needs
Yeah.
to be acknowledged here because he just did so much in terms of finding material and after accessing the artwork, making sure that it could be used in the book. What I was determined to do was to give as wide a range of voices as possible. So there are a number of women who write about Maharaja Ranjit Singh or write about um, the Anglo-Sikh Wars or about what happened in 1857, which is
Mm.
often now referred to as the First War of Indian Independence. Um, I wanted to hear the different reactions to General Dyer and the massacre in Jallianwala Bagh in 1919, the different voices, from 1984 and so on. And I also wanted to have coverage of what I knew to be historically important. So, for example, when it came to places, I knew that I wanted to include all the five takhats. And amazingly, uh, during the years that I was working on it, material arrived, often online, which meant that each of the takhats was represented. For example, I didn't have anything on Huzur Sahib, but then this musicologist visited and provided a really detailed and sympathetic account of the music that was being played when she was in the Gurdwara.
Very interesting, actually. Um, I'd like to tell the viewers here that the book is available to be purchased on www.kashihouse.com, the publisher's website. All are encouraged and requested to please go and have a look. And listening from the stories from Professor Nesbitt, you can tell that there's so many interesting pieces and perspectives from so many people. And I think, Professor Nesbitt, you would agree with me that when we read a book from a particular author, there is a perspective and a train of thought that you follow of just one particular person, of an individual who takes us through this journey. But what really is interesting about your book is that you have given a voice to 170 people, and in effect, they are an equal author for this book alongside yourselves. And here, we're not just guided by what you are showing us, but we have 170 different perspectives to follow. And that is really interesting, isn't it, about the book?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my work as an academic for years was field work. It was ethnography, so I was used to listening to different voices, and as it were, taking a back seat, but giving the voice to other people, and that's what I was essentially doing. I was treating the material that I had from all these women, whether it was visual or verbal, I was treating it as I would my field notes. And in many cases, the women themselves, although they wouldn't have thought of it that way, were ethnographers. They were giving detailed accounts of places they went and often of conversations they had. And actually, some of the most interesting in terms of conversation about the Sikh religion are Christian missionaries, because they are inevitably interested in religion. So Charlotte Tucker, who's in Punjab in the late 19th century, learns Gurumukhi so that she can read the Guru Granth Sahib herself. And she spends time talking to people and reporting in her diaries what people said to her. So yeah, there are all these voices. And what I did was provide, as it were, a narrative thread so that everything is arranged chronologically and thematically. So, for example, there might be a theme like what the women's experience was of meeting Sikh women. And then within that chapter, that would be divided up thematically in terms of, it might be women's jewelry or it might be women's experience of marriage or whatever. But that's the sort of arrangement. And although my history starts with 1809 and Andine in Hardwar meeting female members of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's family, the women themselves talk about Sikhi from the time of Guru Nanak Dev Ji onwards. And they make really interesting comments that I hadn't really thought of. So Charlotte Tucker, the missionary I mentioned, says, oh, Guru Nanak was born in 1469 when Edward IV was on the throne. And immediately there's that connection with British history. And when I was talking about the book a few months ago in the House of Commons, it was amazing to be able to say, and this is what one of the women wrote, and here we are in the place where Edward IV actually lived and died, and there's this immediate sort of connection. And the women frequently did that because they were trying to make everything connect with what their likely readers, who for the most part were English, but in some cases American or mainland European, what they were familiar with. So especially in the 19th century, they tend to use language that relates to people's knowledge of the Bible or of Christianity. In the 20th century, that's sort of no longer the case. And it's interesting too, in the 19th century, when women hear music, whether it's sacred or just other sorts of music, they find it completely unfamiliar, and they use quite derogatory words like howling and cacophony and so on and so on. And then gradually they start saying, it's beautiful, it's mysterious, it's melodious. And in the 20th century, they start recording it because they've got the equipment. And in fact, in the, I think it's 1970s, you have a program on the BBC of Sikh devotional music. So you get these shifts in perception, which are really interesting to track across the 2 centuries. One of the big changes is all the way through the 19th century, the women who visit, and the men actually, find it really, really difficult to come to terms with the idea of removing their footwear. And they find various ways around that, or they complain about it. One of them said she had a cold when she was in Rajasthan because her feet had got wet visiting Harmandir Sahib and so on. In the 20th century, it's not an issue at all. It's not mentioned. It just, it no longer matters. So you see this shift as the women report the different things which are challenges or which attract them as generation succeeds generation. But they're all amazed by the beauty of the Golden Temple. And so we have
True.
beautiful water, an oil painting like that one you just showed, of the Golden Temple. And when we have the first reports, for example, from Emily Eden, who was visiting in 1838, just think it's only recently been clad with its gilded copper plates. So the gold would have been all new and shining wonderfully. And
That's right. Yes, of course. And this is something that, the young generation also needs to be aware of. There's so much to still learn about our own faith. And, a book, albeit it comes from the Western perspective, can also teach us so much more than we wouldn't still know, from our own historians. So it indeed is a very interesting perspective to read about. And you mentioned the meeting of one of these women with the Sikh women and writing about her experience. And I was just coming to my next question that yes, here we are reading about the experiences of these Western women with the culture, with the people. But what would you like to say about the role of Sikh women in the Sikh faith, and as part of your research, what's your take on what role have Sikh women played over past 200 years that you have researched about?
it's a really good question. And the answer is in some ways quite disappointing. The women, many of them, were disappointed that they couldn't communicate easily. Their communication was nearly always through men. That was certainly the case in the early part of the 19th century. So Emily Eden had access. She was welcome to visit the women of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's court. And she says, I wonder how they spend their time. I'd really like to be able to talk to them. But she couldn't. I mean, she never really got to grips with Hindustani, let alone with Punjabi or any of the other languages that she would have needed. And and also it's quite evident that men are much more in the foreground. There's a tendency to paint Akalis or to describe Akali Nihangs because they are so fascinating, and the women are always very attracted by their amazing appearance and all their weaponry and so on. But it's almost always pictures of men, except that Emily Eden in 1838 does portray an Akali Nihang family with a woman, a turbaned woman, on a horse, as well as presumably the husband and child. So there isn't any comment, and she herself didn't have deep knowledge of what she was portraying, but we have that visual record from her. But gradually, of course, it becomes easier for communication. Either women have learned a useful Indian language, as in the case of Charlotte Tucker, or, of course, increasingly there are women who are able to communicate in English. And by the time we get to the 20th century, there are friendships on equal terms between Westerners and Sikhs. And this is in some case created the coverage that the women later on give to Sikhs. So, for instance, Dervla Murphy becomes a famous travel writer. She travels to Punjab by cycling on her bicycle from Ireland. Why did she do it? Because her Sikh pen friend, a young woman in Malaysia, has opened her eyes to Sikhism, to Indian history, and to a different way of looking at things from her own Catholic background in Ireland. And that's why when she's over 30, she gets on her bike and cycles to Punjab. Similarly, with J.K. Rowling, she has a friend, on equal terms, a young Sikh woman who she mentions, like Dervla Murphy, she mentions this friendship in a BBC interview. And it's because the woman that she knew, her friend, told her about the Sikh faith and about the importance of equality in it, that J.K. Rowling, in her first novel after the Harry Potter series, it's called The Casual Vacancy, she has a Sikh woman and her daughter at the centre of the plot. And the daughter in fact, is really the hero because she then proceeds to risk her life to save somebody else. So there you have women, I mean, unnamed women, but women who are speaking about their background and their faith and who are influencing their Western contact to the extent that one cycles to Punjab from Ireland and one has Sikhs in the centre of a novel. So that's a long way of really saying that the relationship between Western women and Sikhs changes, and a lot of it is to do with the lack of a common language between them. Another thing I ought to say is, of course, I've made this distinction between Western women and Sikhs, but that distinction becomes more and more fuzzy. You know, what do you do with Sophia Dalip Singh? Okay, she has an Ethiopian mother, but her father, would have been the Maharaja of Punjab if things had gone a bit better. And increasingly, you have women from the West who marry Sikhs, and so you have their children who are growing up with a dual identity. So the distinction between Western and Sikh becomes much more complex. In the 19th century, pretty much, it's a straightforward one, with the Western women wishing that they could communicate better with the Sikh women.
That's right, of course. And do you think there are any misconceptions about Sikh faith or its people that the book helps address?
Well, I'm not quite sure because, of course, I've reported the women's accounts, and some of them have got misconceptions, either their own misconceptions or they have read or heard something that was misinformed. And I have tried to comment on that, but not always. So you find this great mix. Sometimes the most accurate information comes in from the novelists who've done their research, rather than from the travellers who are just getting sort of fleeting impressions and believing what they hear without actually, researching it. But you do get very different perspectives. And I would like to mention Helena Blavatsky, who is Russian/Ukrainian, and who is very scornful of the British and the way they are prancing around ruling India. And I think that's very illuminating. I mean, some of what she says is not factually accurate, but it's certainly a counterbalance to more English views of the Raj.
Yeah. And were there any stories or images that rather surprised you or challenged your
Oh,
uh, notions, preconceived notions, or your assumptions about Sikh faith?
well, that's a tricky one because I had done a lot of research already. So I was aware of the complex relationship of the Sikh tradition to the surrounding religious environment, and of course to Hindu and to some extent Islamic religious practice. This, of course, is a highly controversial area in terms of the writing by historians in the latter part of the 20th century. But I mean, I was aware before I heard the descriptions that the women gave of the interaction between Sikh and Hindu, and the experience of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, for example, who gave gifts not only to Gurdwaras but also to mandars, respected Hindu pilgrimage places, and so on. But I think some people reading the book may be surprised at the difference between a perception and an experience of being a Sikh for some Sikhs who are described in the book, and their own experience, particularly in this country where religions have been so sharply defined in terms of isms and religious education with its very separated subjects, and with the political history that we've had since the 19th century. So I've tried to be fair and to not to edit these voices, but to comment or to provide footnotes that can, I think, help the reader to situate perhaps what may surprise them in the wider literature on Punjab and on the Sikh tradition.
Okay, sure. What do you think is the relevance of the book for today for women and Sikh people, especially when we are in an era of global migration and interfaith dialogue?
Well, I think one of the significances is that the women are impressed. I mean, almost uniformly, they're impressed by Sikhs. They comment on, their integrity, on their bravery, on their striking appearance. I think anybody reading the book will realise that the women's portraits are respectful ones. I mean, the literal paintings, they
Yeah.
show respect for the Sikh persona. And I think that's really important for Sikhs to realise, even though it was empire, and all the political history that there's been, there was this instinctive respect, an interest and a
Hmm.
respect. And I think the other thing is to do with empowerment, and particularly for girls and women reading the book. I mean, already somebody told me that she'd organised an event to help younger women scholars sort of learn from the experience of older women scholars. And to my amazement, at the end, she said, "And it was reading your book that made me put on this event." So I think there is
Hmm.
something empowering that, even though the women who are writing and painting are Western women rather than Sikh women, it is empowering for women to read this. And I do think it's important to be able to hear at first hand, as it were, or second hand, the experience of people who were living through historical events that were actually before our birth. Whether it's the time of the Gurdwara reform movement or the moves towards Indian independence or the early days of settling in the UK, or for that matter, the book introduces Sikhs who were working in China, and it's not limited to Punjab, and I think that's, of course, very important to have that feeling of this global religion,
Hmm.
which has made an impact on people in so many places.
It indeed has. Of course, it indeed has. I'd like to remind all the viewers that you can read the book, access it through www.kashihouse.com. Two Centuries of Western Women's Art and Writing, Sikh by Professor Eleanor Nesbitt. Before we sign off, we have 30 seconds of time remaining. Professor Nesbitt, what would you like to say to the viewers of Sikh Channel?
Well, I'd just like to mention that there is a discount code. I'm not sure if you're showing it, but when ordering the book, it's SW in capital letters 20, and then OFF in capital letters, SW20 off. So do remember to use that for a 20% discount. But what I'd like to say is thank you to everybody. Thank you to Sikh Channel. Thank you to the viewers. And thank you to the Sikhs who, for the last 40 years of my life, have shown me such incredible hospitality, generosity, receptiveness. I've enjoyed co-authoring with Sikhs, and I'm just open to any comments that come. And I look forward to having a continuing experience of friendship with Sikhs around the world. So thank you.
That's a lovely message. Thank you, Professor Nesbitt, for giving us a chance to have this conversation with you and know more about Sikh, 2 centuries of Western women's art and writing, the new book available on www.kashihouse.com. We will return on Sikh Channel with a new conversation, with a new piece of work, so that the viewers can get to know more and more about other pieces of art coming up. We will do a fateh here. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh Ji.